We left off last time with indulgences. I'm going to finish up chapter 12. I really want to talk about the universities. A lot of people have wondered why it was Europe, Western Europe, not Eastern, but Western Europe that overspread the whole globe and made the most inventions and invented the telephone, the telegraph, the automobile, the airplane. One reason is Europe set up universities. They got a bunch of, you might say, heads together. And the older men began teaching younger men. Now, yes, the universities at first were only for men. The first university was at Bologna, Italy. The first university north of the Alps was at Paris. As I said, north of the Alps. Then another university started at Oxford, England. These universities became known as degree-granting institutions. In other words, if you completed the required coursework, you get a degree. These degrees they gave were bachelor's, master's, and the advanced students got their doctorate. We still have those degrees, but we have added an associate. It's about half of a bachelor's. In here between a master's and a doctorate is a 6th year. A specialist degree is sometimes called, but there are other degrees you can get, but basically it's still those three. The bachelor's, master's, bachelor's meant you had been trained in the field. Master's meant you were qualified to teach on a university level in the field. And doctorate meant you were tops in the field. All right, these universities again are credited with spreading knowledge. Now there have been a few problems. There have been times when they've hindered knowledge. A very famous case is where a college professor wrote an article in 1903 stating that man would never fly a heavier-than-air machine. He proved it mathematically. His mathematics overlooked some things that should have been included. I mean, the problem with mathematical proofs is your mathematics have to include every phenomenon. But he proved that man would never fly a heavier-than-air machine, and later that year, in December 1903, the two brothers from Ohio, the Wright brothers, flew an airplane. This is one example where the professors have known to be badly wrong. And of course, in the modern Western world, a lot of professors are pushing liberalism, leftism, socialism, things like that. So there are some bad sides to it. Nevertheless, universities get a bunch of knowledge together, and scholasticism, oh yes. While I'm on the subject of universities, they actually generally met in the open, and both the students and teachers wore gowns. This distinguished them from the community. They wore the gowns. They'd oftentimes meet out in the open air because they could not afford to buy a building. Eventually, brick, stone buildings were used, and the universities got richer and richer as time went on. All right, scholastics. Scholasticism dealt with a conflict between faith and reason. Inevitably, folk, as we go on, there will come a time when we'll bump into something that seems to be very much like knowledge, that seems to conflict with what we have always believed. And this is normal, natural, it's a part of the learning process. You get some knowledge and it seems like this conflicts. Only folk, the Western Europeans, were able to overcome the obstacles that their religion presented and go ahead and burst out scientifically. In the case of the Chinese, their philosophers squelched all knowledge for hundreds of years. In the case of Islam, their clerics squelched all scientific advancement. And these countries started out ahead of the Western world. But along came their clerics, their philosophers, and squelched it. In Europe, a lot of European churchmen tried to squelch reason, but reason went on. Now, I want to comment on that. Believe me, we could spend a whole semester talking about the conflicts between faith and reason. But folk, just even in the last, let's see, 3 or 4, since our last class, I bumped into something here. I mean, I do a lot of research on space and space travel all my life. Since I was 9 years old, I've had dreams of going to the moon and going to Mars. I keep up with the expedition to Pluto, and my name and the name of my family is on the Saturn expedition, the Cassini Saturn, on a CD. At least I was told it was. But I bumped into something called an EM drive. The EM drive was invented by one person. Unlike a lot of inventions today, I mean, a lot of the inventions today are made by corporations. But here's the thing about the EM drive, and along with it is something else called a Koenig drive. Both of these things are supposed to be able to propel rockets in space if they really work. They started off working. Contrary to Newton's law of motion, the rocket power says for every action there must be an equal but opposite reaction. So if you fire a rocket fuel this way, a rocket this way, the rocket will go this way. Fundamental physics. Well, in this case, you have a reaction without an action. That's absurd, that's impossible. Well, I remind you, everything about quantum mechanics seems to be absurd and impossible. Quantum physics completely defies Newton's laws of no motion. Now, how many of you have any idea what I'm talking about? Okay, several hands are going up. Very, very good. Yeah. Yes. All right. What I'm saying, folks, is for the conflict between faith and reason. Now, with all respect to our scientists and our technologists, what we have done, we've made better machines, better gadgets. I mean, today's cars, believe me, they are much, much better than the cars were when I was a kid. Today's tires on the cars are much better. Today's mufflers on the cars will last the lifetime of the car. We used to, this month it's a muffler, next month it's a couple of tires, then next month after that it's a wheel bearing, next month after that it's a transmission, then it's a universal joint. One repair after another constantly. Well, today, these cars come along 10,000, 20, 30, 40, 50,000 miles. Maybe a battery replacement here and there. Very few. All right. We're making better gadgets. Now, there's two types of science. The practical. That's where you put this part next to this one and get something to work. Gadgetry. Practical. Then there's theoretical science. What makes it work? In the realm of theoretical science, folk, everything you really know for sure about theoretical science can be summed up in one word, and that one word has 7 letters in it. Does anybody know what word I'm thinking about? The one word that describes all that we know about the universe outside our solar system, all we really know about quantum, the universe below the level of the atom, that one word is, anybody know? Nothing. Oh, I'm in favor of trying to theorize, but every theory we have that every theory that explains it has some compelling reason why it has to be wrong. What about Newton's law of gravity? It works inside the solar system. Go outside the solar system and stop. Hey, gravity can't make the galaxies hold together because there's just not enough matter. So they invent dark matter, and it can now claim 90% of the universe is dark matter. Well, we haven't seen dark matter, but it must exist. Any of you have heard? Yeah. And oh yeah, because so many of the galaxies seem to be going away from us at 25,000 miles a second. We haven't gotten anything go that fast, folks. Then there must be a whole lot of energy out there. What kind of energy could get galaxies to go away from the 25,000? Well, it must be dark energy. The fact is, we don't have an explanation for it. So before you think that your faith conflicts with reason, keep in mind, reason so far has explained to us, I mean, in one word, nothing. Oh, we keep trying, but I've read where some scientists are now saying there's some things that just simply are not going to be explained. All right. The scholastics so liked a particular man whom we've met before. Man's name Aristotle. In other words, scholasticism was it was like a look backward. Now, a lot of church people did not like the study of Aristotle. Aristotle was not a Christian. Well, he lived, what, 300 years before Jesus, so he could hardly have been a Christian. But nevertheless, some people said, hey, he gave us a lot of knowledge and we should study. Others said, no, we should not study him because he'll lead mankind astray. Now, into this scenario stepped Thomas Aquinas. Now, you might never have heard of him. Thomas Aquinas belongs in the same field of men like Plato, Einstein, Newton, and these men explained the universe as best they could, explain it in such a way as to get a lot of people to believe them, not only through their generation, but many generations later. Thomas Aquinas believed that he knew everything and he had an explanation for everything. Today we almost laugh at him, but he believed that he could answer every question that could be raised through his type of reasoning, that he knew it all. Now today, Einstein spent his last years of his life working on the unified field theory, or today we call it the TOE, that someday we're going to discover a theory of everything. Some theory that will explain everything in the universe. But again, a lot of science are giving up. Oh no, there's some things we're not going to ever explain. There's some things that just do not make sense. But Thomas Aquinas believed he had explained the universe. He tried to reconcile all the knowledge of mankind into one unified body of knowledge. As far as most of us are concerned, he failed. Latin was replaced with a vernacular. The word vernacular means the local spoken language. So in England it was English, in France and French. At one time the church had tried to conduct its church services in Latin. Well, then they began to conduct them in the vernacular. And as some people began to translate the Bible into vernacular, particularly John Wycliffe translated the Bible into English for his people, and other people tried the same thing, they met with a lot of opposition. But Latin was being replaced by the vernacular. In other words, vernacular means each local language. All right. Yeah, yes. Oh, if it bothers you, no, I can't ask to turn it down. If it bothers you, can step up closer to the front of the room.
You can't ask me to turn it down.
I'm sorry. I don't know what they're doing, but I'm not. I don't feel at liberty to do that. Okay, hopefully it takes care of itself. I have at times made noise myself more than I should have.
Not that loud.
And, we have to kind of bear with each other. All right. Art, in the field of art, these people were known for building cathedrals, and I do want you to learn this about the cathedrals. There were two types that they built during this period: the Romanesque and the Gothic. Turns out the Gothic has nothing to do with the Goths. Now, the Romanesque, just in brief, they had barrel roofs. In other words, they were shaped somewhat like an Indian wigwam. Maybe like a loaf of bread. They had barrel roofs, and it was rounded. They were trying to get a roof made entirely of stone. And again, one way to do that is to get it rounded. So because they were stone, they were dark inside, but they were at least sturdy. All right. That was the Romanesque. It was shaped somewhat, the roof was shaped like half of a barrel. They called them barrel roofs. Now the Gothic, they had pointed roofs, pointed straight up. Everything about the Gothic cathedrals suggested heaven or heavenward. And they were often ribbed. In other words, one after another in what we call a ribbed fashion. But again, everything about them was pointed skyward. Ribbed vaults, They also had the stained glass windows. Stained glass. Now, folks, for those of you who want to review this stuff I'm talking will be on the test. And if I don't go over it, I mean, I'll be doing an injustice to you, really. So this is what I'm going to review. But this stuff about stained glass, again, that made the Gothic cathedrals very well lit inside. You, at least in the daytime, you go into them in the daytime, and the sun would be shining through like it's a bright sunny day out, and the sun would cast multicolors because the sun's light would be diffused by the various colors of the stained glass. And it made for a really beautiful scene, to say the least. All right, with that, we end chapter 12 and go on to chapter 13. Chapter 13. They start with the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire was what was left after the Roman Empire died. It's sometimes been called the Eastern Roman Empire. At one point it had all the Eastern Empire, including all of Turkey, all of Syria, all of what is today Iran and Iraq, and all of North Africa, at least what is today Libya and Egypt. Yes?
Who was on Thomas?
Thomas Aquinas, he was the one who explained everything, and or at least believed he had, and believed he could answer every question. He was like one of the top men of learning of his day. He's been forgotten about because as science has progressed, his ideas have been left behind. But then again, as time goes on, a lot of what Newton said is left behind. A lot of what Einstein said is also left behind. And especially a lot of what Darwin said is left behind. A lot of what Sigmund Freud said is left behind. It's just, these men were, I mean, they did the best they could with the knowledge they had, but then we collect more knowledge and find out that a lot of times, a lot of what they thought to be true was not true. The Byzantine Empire was the bright spot in Christendom when the Roman Empire declined, when the West was declining and falling apart. The Byzantine Empire was still strong. But it had a big problem. It never separated church from state. Church and state were one. And if you went to the capital, there was the church. If you went to the church, there was the state. Seemingly one and the same. And this, a lot of people believe, led to its downfall. They fought long wars with Persia, in which the Byzantines eventually won, but they weakened both empires. And then as soon as both empires had weakened, and the Persian Empire, out of Arabia came the Muslims, and they conquered Persia, and they began to whittle away at the Byzantines until eventually they conquered all the Byzantine Empire. But before they did, the capital of the Byzantine Empire was Constantinople. You won't find Constantinople on a map today. When Constantinople was conquered by the Muslims, they changed its name to Istanbul. Oh yeah, 50 years ago, Kellogg's Corn Flakes would have a commercial, and they asked, what is the corniest city in the world? The corniest city in the world was Constantinople. Oh, but they changed its name to Istanbul. Any of you who know anything about farming know something about what I'm talking about, corn and ears, you know, why you shouldn't tell secrets in a cornfield. There are too many ears. All right, believe that. All right. Anyway, Constantinople had a huge amphitheater which could seat 60,000 persons. I mean, that was before they had structural steel. And they had a lot of chariot races. Constantinople was the last of the Byzantine cities to fall. However, before it fell, starting off, the first great ruler it had was Justinian. Justinian is remembered for his law code, among other things. And the law code influenced European judges for decades. Justinian almost rebuilt Roman Empire. He got the southern part of Italy, he got all of Greece, he got the eastern part of the eastern Mediterranean world. I mean, he had a very large empire that almost rebuilt the old Roman Empire. But a couple of things went wrong. He overextended himself and emptied his treasury, and when he did, there was no more money to be found. And the empire was starting to collapse even before he died. And then 3 years after he died, his empire was fragmented. Everything he had built was undone. Also, a plague hit at that time too, and the plague did a lot to weaken the empire. And in those days when plagues hit, there was nothing they could do about it, as the plague eventually burned itself out. And often, folk, that took up to 50 years. What happened eventually was only the people who had immunity to it were left, and everybody else then was dead. And then, only then would the plague stop. But oftentimes before that happened, maybe up to a fourth or a third of the population would be taken away. So the population declined, and about the time the population declined due to the plague, due to wars, due to bad economics, Islam came on the scene. And they threatened. Now, one thing that held Islam at bay for a long time was Greek fire. I've had more than one student do a paper on Greek fire. Greek fire is a secret, and as far as I know, we still don't know what the secret was. It was said that when a Greek fire touched a ship, that ship was going down, and even when the ship was fully sunk, you could see the flame burning even underwater. This may sound fetched, but I mean, folks, there have been persons who have said a Greek fire might have been a crude form of a dirty bomb. We simply don't know. Some people believe that the ingredients were maybe tar and sulfur mixed together with maybe a little bit of gunpowder mixed in, and we don't know what all else. Magnesium, if any of you know anything about magnesium, well, if you catch magnesium on fire, it burns with a flame that is brighter than anything that you can imagine. It's so bright you can't look at it. If any of you studied this in chemistry, so it might have contained some magnesium. We simply don't know. Now, in addition, another group of people came from Central Asia called the Bulgars. The Bulgars came and eventually settled in what is today Bulgaria, right here just on the other side of Turkey, north of Greece, Bulgaria. I mean, of all the peoples we've talked about who came from Central Asia, the Huns, the Magyars, the Slavs, the Turks, the Bulgars, several groups of people that would migrate from Central Asia in wave after wave, probably owing to bad climate. But the Bulgars threatened the empire. Eventually they settled down. But not until first they conquered part of the empire and settled into part of the empire that they conquered. Now, as time went on, the empire began to clash with Rome because the Bishop of Rome, namely the Pope, said, I am the head of the church. And the Byzantine Emperor said, I'm the head of the church. And they clashed over this issue, and eventually the Eastern and Western churches completely split. The year, I believe, was not, well, they actually split twice. They split in the 800s, got back together for a while, then split again, and finally in the year 987, don't worry about the year, but the two churches split for good. And they remain split to this day. The Patriarch of Constantinople excommunicated the Pope, and the Pope in turn excommunicated him, and they formed separate churches. They have a few differences. For one, the Byzantine Church, it's called the Eastern Orthodox, or sometimes the Greek. It's Eastern Orthodox, or again called Greek.
You forgot an R in the
What's that?
Greek. Forgot an R.
G-R-E-O-R, thank you. Greek, oh yeah, geek, yeah. The Greek, sometimes called Greek. The church has remained split, and it was the first real genuine split in Christendom in hundreds of years, and eventually the Western church was split into Catholic and Protestant. But they have a couple differences. One difference is the Eastern church allows some of its clergy to marry. A clergyman, a man who wants to be a clergyman, has to decide at the beginning, am I going to be celibate or am I going to marry? Celibate means a life with no sex. So they do have a choice. They will take in married men to be their clergy if he announces at the beginning he's going to be married. Of course, the Roman Church insists that all their clergy, all the way from local priests all the way to Pope, be celibate. And another difference, of course, is the Greek Church does not recognize the authority of the Pope. Over the last 1,000 years, there have come up numerous other differences. Now, does it say 987? Yeah, 987 was the year of, I believe, the complete split. But what happened was the east of this region found itself harassed strongly by the Muslims, and finally the Byzantine emperor realized he could not fight off the Muslims by himself, so he asked the West for help. And this was the beginning of the Crusades. Crusades. The Crusades are a controversial point in European history. As time went on and we tried to reconcile with the Muslims, we would condemn the Crusades. Now it seems like the rest of the world is about to get together and do the same thing. And folk, I really don't think we had it wrong the first time. There have been persons who have issued an apology for the Crusades, but other persons, we need to apologize for that apology. We do not owe an apology for the Crusades, owing to the fact that the Muslims were coming in and attacking Europe from Spain, from Sicily, and from Turkey, from east, south, and west. And basically it was simply where the Crusaders, whereas Europe took up the sword and went into their territory, as people will, and we started fighting on their territory. Of course, from their point of view, the Muslims' point of view, the West started it. From the Western point of view, they started it. The First Crusade, whether or not it was right or wrong, but to go into some detail about what happened, the First Crusade conquered the Holy Land. Now, the First Crusade caught the Muslim world off guard. The Muslim world was divided and busy fighting off more people from protecting the Mongolians. And they just simply were not prepared for these thousands upon thousands of European nobles and knights and common people who poured in. And the Crusaders simply they didn't have an easy time of it, but they greatly outnumbered the Muslims, or at least they outnumbered the Muslims they met, and they conquered. They set up a couple of kingdoms, including the Kingdom of Jerusalem right here, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem was to last 100 years. It was mostly led by French nobles. No kings went on it. Then came the Second Crusade. The Muslims tried to reassert themselves, so another crusade came in to try to conquer Islam. The Second Crusade did have a few kings, particularly Louis VII, who took his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine along. The Second Crusade accomplished nothing. It didn't really lose, but it didn't win either. And after a while, the Crusaders all went home. All right, then came the Third Crusade. Third Crusade was led by three kings: King Richard of England, Philip Augustus of France, and Frederick of the Holy Roman Empire. Frederick first. All right, then they thought, well, these three kings, Islam does not have a chance. What they did not know was Islam had been reunited. At least this part, not all of it, but part of Islam had been reunited under a very, I want to call him a charismatic ruler named Saladin. Saladin made news about the time, I guess a lot of you were being born, and that Saddam Hussein claimed that he was descended from Saladin, and he was an admirer of two people, Nebuchadnezzar and Saladin. Nebuchadnezzar, because Nebuchadnezzar defeated the Jews and conquered Egypt and built up an empire, and Saladin because he had driven out the Crusaders. Anyway, what happened to the Crusaders? Frederick tried to cross a river in heavy armor. He drowned. When he did, his entire army went home. So no more Frederick. Philip Augustus got the whole land, but did not really engage the enemy. He got homesick or whatever. For some reason, he turned back, and Richard always hated him for it. So when Philip turned back, so did most of the French army. That left Richard the Lionhearted to fight against Saladin. Richard fought bravely and fought well. I've read a couple of books about it. I mean, Richard thought he had a chance, but Saladin and the Muslims simply outdid him. And Richard finally had to go home in defeat. It was said that Richard rode his horse to the top of the Mount of Olives overlooking Jerusalem. And instead of looking on the city of Jerusalem across the way, and I've been there myself, he raised his shield to block his view and said, I am not going to look at the city that God has not allowed me to conquer. Anyway, Richard started his trip home and got captured and held for a ransom. It failed. All right. Then came the Fourth Crusade. The Fourth Crusade, instead of fighting the Muslims, they wound up going against the Byzantine Empire, and they captured Constantinople and held it for about 40 years. And it forced the Constantinople people to flee, and the Crusaders held it. Eventually, the Byzantines were able to get back their capital. However, irreparable damage had been done to the Byzantine Empire that could not be repaired, and it paved the way for the Byzantine Empire to fall into the hands of the Muslims, the Byzantine Empire fell in the year 1453, and this is one of the few dates I'll write down. Two things happened that made 1453 a turning point. Number one, Constantinople fell. Number two, the 100 Years' War ended, which I hope to talk about before the date is out. Now,
I'm sorry, what was the second one again?
the 100 Years' War ended. And a lot of historians have said that the 1453 then is the dividing line between medieval history and modern. The modern world was well on its way to starting, with the Byzantine Empire gone and with the Muslim, I mean not the Muslim, but with the 100 Years' War over with. Now, there were many more crusades than these four. Many, many more. They're all told there were about 200 crusades, of which 9 of them were really important, big. The other ones were much smaller. The Crusaders began quarreling among themselves, and eventually the fervor died. The Crusades started in the year 1095 and ended in the year 1290 with the last one. It was basically 195 years, almost 200 years. And the reason there wasn't another one mounted was the Black Death hit Europe in 1314, and famine hit Europe also, and sickness, and Europe was in no shape to take the offensive against Islam. So the crusading zeal stopped, at least for that period of history. I had a professor at UT who had majored in the Crusades, and he insisted that there was nothing at all good that came out of them. Everything that he did for Europe was all bad. I mean, you know, he was, even though he was of European descent, he was all pro-Arab. I do not know what he would think. I mean, he's deceased now. I do not know what he would think if he could see what's going on now in the world happening now. He said the United States was to blame for all the trouble in the Middle East because of our support for Israel. Well, fast forward to 2015, and Israel hardly even makes news anymore because it's, look, the trouble was not with Israel, never was to begin with. The problem simply is the West made all the inventions, the telephone, telegraph, computer, and Islam was left behind, and they just feel very, very, very upset that all of mankind's inventions were invented by someone else and left them behind. And they are determined to hasten the end of the world by killing everybody they can reach. Now, the Crusades did have some really negative impacts. One of them was a lot of the Crusaders, these killed Jews in what's called a pogrom. The word pogrom means a fight against the Jews. Jew hatred has gone on all the way down through European history and is still alive. It's sometimes called anti-Semitism. But the Crusaders would go to a Jewish community and set the community on fire with the Jews inside it. And folk, I hate to say it, but I mean, I feel like I have to. The Crusaders would then raise their hands toward heaven and praise God hilariously while the Jews inside were screaming their life away. But this actually went on. They blamed the Jews for all the problems. The Jews were blamed for losing the wars to the Muslims, just like Hitler blamed the Jews for losing World War I. I mean, it's easy to do, blame someone else. It's natural human nature. There's another crusade that I just feel like I must mention. This one's not in your book, but there were two crusades that were run by children. Children as young as 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, up to 16 and 17. 50,000 children are known to have participated in these two crusades, just about all of them German. These children believed that they could do what the adults could not do, so they marched from Germany and went to, but none of them ever reached Constantinople. Every child who participated in the Children's Crusade was either killed or sold into slavery. The Muslims would practice slavery up until, in some cases, the 21st century. The story of the Children's Crusade has been compared by some to the story of the Pied Piper. The Pied Piper could play such beautiful music and lure the children into caves with his beautiful music, and once in the cave, the children were never seen again. Be that as it may, I can't help but wonder what would get into parents that would make parents let their children go on such a venture. Whatever. The Children's Crusade got nowhere and did no damage to the enemy. All right. Moving on in chapter 13, we're coming to the 14th century, no, the 1300s. This period is known as a time of turmoil and a time of trouble when Europe underwent a lot of changes. When Genghis Khan's men came from Mongolia and headed west, they might not have been aware that rats were following them. Well, the rats were carrying a flea. The flea carried the germ that was to cause the Black Death. I've heard the name of the germ. I'm going to try to pronounce it. But basically, these rats then followed Genghis Khan's troops. Every time Genghis Khan's men would sleep at night, the rats would come in and try to eat their food, and their fleas would get on to everything. In the year 1307, the Black Death hit Europe, starting at Genoa, and the Black Death was to wipe out a third of Europe's population. Now, what led to it, other than the fact, okay, the fleas that were carried by the rats, and the fleas, oh yeah, rats, if you know anything about parasitology, a lot of parasites that will live on rats will also live on humans. The black rat carried a flea, but these parasites would not live in the brown rat. Eventually the brown rat came and drove the black rat away and somewhat into the plague. But the bubonic plague, of which the Black Death was a part, was to last for the next 400 years, off and on in Europe. But what set it off? It wasn't just the fleas. Something else happened, folk. I think you might have somebody want to say. There was a climate change. The climate cooled. Now, folks, this is in your book. This is standard history. we know this happened. Summers became shorter, and crops that Europeans had grown, for one thing, I mean, they simply could not grow anymore because the last frost would come later in the spring, and the first frost would come earlier, and some plants that took longer to grow that they had to grow between frosts, the last frost and the first frost, simply would not grow. And the summers were also noticeably cooler, and then it came a time of storms. A climate change is always followed with storms, whether the climate changes from colder to warmer or from warmer to colder. Folk, the warmer things are, the better it is for all life, including human life, and the colder things are, the worse it is for life. If I'm wrong, please tell me. Nobody, maybe by your silence, either you're admitting you don't know. Well, if that's the case, you're here to learn. Or hopefully you're not afraid to speak up. But if you don't know, then you should keep quiet. I've studied this extensively, folks. The Middle Ages, the high Middle Ages were as hot as a firecracker, and then things cooled, and Europeans died off in droves. So did the Chinese, so did India, and apparently so did the North American Indians. Die off in droves because of the cooling of the climate. Greenland became an ice sheet, whereas before the Vikings had lived in Greenland like they had lived back in Scandinavia, Greenland has remained an ice sheet to this day. Iceland became an even bit heavier ice sheet. The climate cooled and death came. Constant rains, crops were destroyed, starvation resulted. Europe's population reached its high in the year 1300. They were not to reach that same high again until 1750. The population declined. In the early 1600s, it started to revive again, and then in 1680, Europe experienced another ice age that brought the population down again. And yes, millions of people died off in Europe and China and India and possibly North America too, which was why the Europeans had an easier time conquering the North American Indians. Now, you notice from 1300 to 1680 is almost 400 years. 300 and some more years. From 1680 to 2015, folk, is a little bit more than another 300 years. Why am I saying this? Some people who have studied this say that the climate undergoes a change, a downturn, every 350 or so years, and we are due one. And given a few more years, we're going to experience another ice age. In 1977, our country experienced a terrible, terrible winter. And the science were called out. I mean, we had the Chesapeake Bay froze over, which never happens normally. The Chesapeake Bay froze. We had snow flurries seen in Miami. This is documented. In my case, I was teaching in a school in Calhoun, Georgia, and they closed the school for almost a week. The principal said school was closed until further announcement. The buses came, everybody got home, and a big ice and snowstorm came that lasted for days, and the temperature got down below zero. And they were predicting ice age, ice age. Today they're predicting global warming. Oh, just check it out. It's in the history books. And some people are predicting that, hey, another ice age is on the way. Be that as it may, the Black Death hit Europe, killed a third of Europe's population. Genoese sailors brought the disease to Sicily. The plague would sometimes wipe out whole villages. Now, some people were not affected as much by it. Particularly, two types of people who were hated, by the way. Old maids did not get affected, and Jews. Does anybody have any idea what saved the old maids? I may have told you. Yes? What's that? For the Jews, yes. For the old maids, there was something else that they had. What do old maids almost always have around their dwelling?
Cats.
Cats. Yeah, cats. Well, what good did the cats do them? The cats kept away the rodents. And without rodents, of course, hey, that meant that the occupants of the home did not get the fleas. Well, it also meant that they wound up being burned at the stake as witches, because they said, hey, it's these witches who are causing a plague. They're the reason, so if we burn them, the plague will stop. It didn't help, but nevertheless, that was the idea. So they blamed the old maids, the witches, and burned a lot of the stake. As for the Jews, now, the thing about the Jews, Moses commanded them to be clean. In the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, there's a lot said about cleanliness. The Jews were told every year before harvest, clean out all your old grain. Well, that was great, significant, because the grain was what the rats would come to try to eat. When they cleaned out the grain, that meant the rats left, because there was nothing to eat. When the rats left, of course, also it's known cleanliness does a lot to keep down plagues. We found that out. Well, in the year 1750, two things happened. Number one, well, actually three, the climate changed when it started to warm up. Number two, smallpox vaccination was, I'm not going to write it down, it's not one, but the smallpox vaccination was invented. And number three, Louis Pasteur discovered that these microbes they'd been seeing in a microscope since 1610, that these microbes cause disease. And these microbes would be killed by soap and water or killed by heat. Therefore, he taught Europeans to boil their water, to cook their food very clean, and to cook it hot, that is. That would kill the microbes. And Europe's population, the population of the rest of the world, began to rise. And especially the Chinese, whose population really began to rise so much that China couldn't hold them. But it all was the same thing. Between Louis Pasteur and Edward Jenner and smallpox, Louis Pasteur and pasteurization, cleanliness, Europe's population finally began to rise. Oh yes, the climate started warming up about that time too. Three things. Well, Europe finally eventually began to recover its population, but in the meantime, the plagues made it look like the peasants could rebel. The nobility seemed weakened, so peasants began to rebel, and peasant rebellions would occur from the 1300s all the way up to 1848, when the last one, or if you think the Russian Revolution of 1905 was the last peasant rebellion. But the peasants began to rebel against their nobles, and one thing that encouraged them, it was learned if the peasant could get a gun, a peasant with a gun could even kill a knight in armor. And the nobles, the peasants rebelled, but always the peasants lost. However, when the fight was over, the nobles and peasants would sit down and work out an agreement that oftentimes gave the peasants everything they'd asked for, because the nobles were fearful of another uprising. So the peasants began to get more and more rights, and they began to prosper. But not until the peasants killed a whole lot of nobility and a whole lot of knights. And also, because there were so many workers who had died, there was a scarcity of workers, and the nobles who hired the workers had to pay higher wages, so wages went up. This also helped more and more people buy their freedom. Prosperity came to the common people at the expense of the nobles. Towns began to spring up. Nobles began to have a hard time finding laborers. All right. But there was one difference. Now, I took a course in the 14th century when I was at University of Tennessee, and our professor emphasized there was one difference in the 4th century. Europe experienced a similar downturn, probably brought on by global cooling. Europe experienced down, but the Europeans succumbed, and they went into a dark age. In the 14th century, the Europeans were hurt, but they did not go into a dark age. If anything, they became more and more enlightened, and if anything, they became better for all the adversity they'd gone through. But in the 14th century, 1,000 years later, another downturn, but Europe did not succumb to that. All right. Now, while this was going on, there's another event that I must mention. Out of the Crusades came 3 orders of monks. They were called the Knights Hospitallers, who started the hospitals. And a lot of people believe that hospitals came about as a result of the Crusades. One of the good things that came from the Crusades. The Knights Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights and the Knights Templar. The Teutonic Knights went up here to Latvia and Estonia and tried to establish what they hoped to be an ideal kingdom here. The Templars supposedly discovered a big secret while working around Solomon's temple. And in the course of discovering a big secret, they formed an organization in which they collected all the knights that they could get and formed you might say, a monastic order of fighting men. And their job, among other things, was to drive out the Muslims out of to overcome Islam throughout the world. But supposedly, if they learned a secret, one of the secrets they learned was a way to get a lot of money was through banking. They set up banks and built up such trust that even kings began banking with them. And they got a tremendous amount of wealth. But unlike the Knights Hospitallers, who were devoted to charity, the Templars had nothing to do with charity. And finally, well, all right, the King of France, King Philip the Fair. Philip the Fair became really enamored with these knights and wondered just what do they do in their secret meeting. They were a secret organization, like our Masons or whatever, like a lot of fraternities. They were a secret organization. Philip, though, was unable to join because being a king, he was expected to marry and have children to carry on the succession. Well, one day his wife died. Philip then became celibate. So Philip asked to join, and one thing you don't do, folks, is ask to join these organizations. If they want you, they'll find you. They'll come after you. But Philip asked to join, and he was blackballed. Well, Philip was very upset, so he got 5 knights together and said in secret, now I want you 5, see if they'll let you join, and when you join, infiltrate the group, and then come back and report to me what they do in secret. Well, folks, we're going to level with you. Here's what the knights reported. The 5 knights reported back to Philip that the Templars in their secret meetings were practicing sodomy, Lucifer worship, engaging in sex even with demons. I mean, this is what they said. Philip sent a letter to the Pope with this, and the Pope and Philip decided together that the Knights Templar must be destroyed. All right. So on Friday the 13th, now folk, we just experienced a Friday the 13th, and this last Friday the 13th was disastrous for some folk. That's when the terrorists hit Paris on Friday the 13th. Maybe nobody noticed. There have been disasters that have occurred on Friday the 13th before. Jesus was crucified on Friday the 13th. As for the Templars, Saladin had told the Crusaders, okay, but they all go in peace, except put your Templars over here. Once he got the Templars, he told his men, all right, run them all down and kill them all. This occurred on Friday the 13th. And on Friday the 13th, Philip the Fair of France rounded up all the Knights Templar he could and started to slaughter them. But the Grand Vizier said to Philip, I'm innocent. And furthermore, he said, your dynasty will not continue. Your dynasty come to an end, and I want you to meet me around the throne of God, which we're going to discuss it. Within the same year, both the king, Philip the Fair, and the Pope were dead. Now, supposedly, the Vizier had cursed Philip's dynasty. And Philip had 3 sons. He thought, as he died, I have nothing to worry about. My 3 sons follow. These 3 sons reigned for 18 years total, one after another, of average of 6 years apiece. And all 3 of them died without heirs. And at that point, the house of Valois came to an end. Pardon me, not that house of Valois began. The house of Capet, the Capetian dynasty, came to an end with Philip the Fair's 3 sons. All right. By any chance, how many of you have heard of any of this? I'm not asking if you believe it. How many have heard of any of this? 1, 2, all right. The other class, 4 of you. The other class, about that many hands went up. So some of you have heard. I'm not asking if you believe it. As for the Templars, they became known by another name. They fled to Scotland, where the King of Scotland welcomed them. They helped the King of Scotland get his independence from England. And they told the King of Scotland that their treasure was sent to the land of America across the sea. And folk, it has been proven that Templars actually did come here, and there have been many attempts made to find the Templar treasury. It has not been found. Now, as for the ideal kingdom, the Templars believed they had the ideal kingdom to set up. A lot of folk believe that their ideal country became the United States of America. I see one head nodding. You've heard this before. And the United States was, the founders of the United States was primarily Masons. All the founding fathers, including George Washington, Jefferson, were made. The Masons were an offshoot from the Templars, if you believe it. Now again, you don't have to believe it because it can't be exactly, completely proven. The Masonic symbol is the Great Pyramid. And the ideal state would be a state where there'd be no kings and no nobles. We still don't have kings in this country and nobles. And a state of the free. There's a lot more I could say, but I'm beginning to feel uncomfortable saying what I could say about this. Anyway, now, when the House of Capet came to an end, the French people chose a man from the House of Valois to be their king. But the King of England, Edward III by name, said, "No, wait a minute. I'm closer related to the old royal Capetian dynasty than this man is, and you're king, I should be king." This was the beginning of the 100 Years' War, where the King of England claimed the throne of the King of France, and they began to clash. This act is known as, there's 100 years, yes, it was the last 100 years, on again, off again. Now, the 100 Years' War was a big change in warfare for several reasons. One thing, knights in armor began to play less and less of a role as gunpowder came into widespread use, and the gunpowder could knock down a knight. They did not use rifles, remember. The rifle was still not very well developed, but they did use cannon, and a cannonball could really do a cannonball would do a knight in armor in. So the knights, as a result, put on heavier and heavier armor, to where if a knight fell down, it took 5 men to pull him back up. He could not pull him. And most of the knights who fell suffocated. Also, if the horse fell, the knight would fall into it. Most of the time, the horse and knight died together. If the horse broke his leg, of course, most of you may know, when a horse breaks his leg, there's nothing you do for the horse except kill it. That was true, even more true then. Today, we've gotten a few horses with broken legs to live, but it's really difficult. Depends on the type of break it is. All right. Also, the longbow. Basically, the common man became more important warfare. The longbow can be used. The longbow was 6 foot long, longer than most of the men of that day. And yet, when I was a kid, I'd break off tree branches and make bows and arrows. But these men could shoot a longbow, and the arrows would actually be hit with such force, they would penetrate a knight's shield and his armor. And basically, there were not a whole lot of protection against it. Then, of course, even worse than a longbow, there was a crossbow. The crossbow was so strong that it had to be pulled back with a lever. That the bow had to be set with a lever because it could not be set with an ordinary pull of an arm by an ordinary man. And when the crossbow was shot, it was shot like today's rifle. It was shot with, the stock with a rifle, and shot with the fire of the trigger. And when it fired, it would penetrate a knight's shield and his armor both. So between the crossbow and the longbow, knights became somewhat outmoded. The foot soldier then became more and more important. The pikeman, again, an ordinary foot soldier who would line up with his pikes, sometimes 12 and 13 feet long, and they would form a wall of these pikes, shoulder to shoulder, in tight formation, and simply, they would even bring down a knight on a horse. Because the knight would not just be hit by one pike, but when a knight charged into an army of pikemen, several pikes could be expected to hit the knight and the horse both, and bring the horse down. When the horse went down, the knight usually died with it. So a lot was to change. Now, of all the battles, the most famous battle in the war were the two of them, the Battle of Crécy and the Battle of Agincourt. But in the Battle of Crécy, The French were fighting the old-fashioned way with knights in armor on horseback, and they galloped into battle very confident, but a rainstorm came up and the ground was muddy. Much too often the horses slipped in the mud. And of course the result was disastrous, because once the knight fell, it took 5 men to pull him back up, and most of the knights who fell died, suffocated. If they weren't destroyed with armor, they suffocated inside it. The English, in the meantime, was just sitting on, their feet, so they didn't have to worry about it. And the English were firing their long bows and their crossbows, or waiting with pikes. And these arrows brought down a whole lot of knights in armor, and for the first time in warfare in hundreds of years, you had ordinary, low-born soldiers raining down high-born knights and lords, nobility. The battle was an English victory, but the French outnumbered the English 5-1, 4-1 at least. And the fact is, England never could really mount an effective means of conquering all of France. Well, okay, time went on. I'm not going to take 100 years to fight the war, but basically, you have a king of France now named Charles the Mad. Charles the Mad was approached one day while he was leading his army by an insane man. Now, folks, you can believe what you want to. This is the way the story is told. This insane man went up and touched the person of the king, and the king went insane himself. He wound up striking and killing one of his best knights, one of his most trustworthy servants. They finally got the king under control. King Charles VI was to live in a state of in and out of insanity for the next 30 years of his life. Sometimes he goes as long as 2 years like being insane. And sometimes he would go for months at a time completely insane. That's why he's known as Charles the Mad. He was beloved, though. His people felt sorry for him. They called in witches. They called in persons who cast out demons, exorcists. They called in exorcists. They called in everything they could. They got priests to come and pray over him. They had prayer meetings for the king. Nothing worked. He would go in and out of insanity. Well, some years before he died, Charles VI willed his throne to the King of England. He said, when I die, you get the throne. Now, anyone who knows anything about wills, there's always a question about the mental condition of the person who makes it out. Charles VI was known to have mental problems. Well, Charles VI had a son, after he married the boy, had a son who became Charles VII. And when Charles VI died, the people of France rose up and said, fooey on his will. He was insane when he made it out. He didn't know what he was doing. He was known to be insane. So the people of France chose Charles VII to be the king. And England then sent an army, and the fighting started again. This turned out to be the last of the fighting. But the English started out winning. Charles VII lost territory after territory to the English. One battle after another went to the English. Charles VII was a very indecisive man. I mean, his big problem, he was his own worst enemy. And a lot of the French nobility then began to side with the English. And things began to look very, very, very dark for England. Into this scenario, there was a young girl living on the border of a village called Domremy, like Domremy, the musical terms. In the village of Domremy was a young girl named Joanne. She was from the family of the Arcs. We know of her as Joan of Arc, or Joan d'Arc. Joanne began to pray, "O Lord, save France." Then she began hearing voices. Now, I'm not going to attempt, folk, to explain what went on. I mean, I don't know how many of you, there have been movies made of Joan of Arc. There have been a lot of books written about her. Yes, she was a real person. I mean, when I first read this, when I was 9 years old, I wondered, did she even exist? And I went home and talked to Dad. My dad, oh yeah, she definitely existed, and yes, she definitely was real. But she began to hear voices, and the voices began to direct her, go to the king, collect an army, and lead your people to victory against the French. And folk, I'll leave